Synopsis: Christy has a problem. She has to beat her roommate and lifelong frenemy, Alice, at a game of golf to win a bet. If she can win, she'll get the apartment they share for the weekend. A weekend of privacy with her boyfriend Greg. The only problem is that she's awful at golf. Greg, however, is a scratch golfer. Enter the wizard, who, as usual, is very helpful. "There's no way this will work," Greg said, looking at his very pretty girlfriend, Christy. "Come on, Greg, it'll work, and it's the only way that I can beat Alice." "Well, you shouldn't have made that bet with her in the first place." "Hey, you were the one who said all I needed was a few golf lessons and I'd be playing like a pro," Christy accused. "So this is really your fault. Besides, after you beat Alice, she'll have to give us the apartment for the rest of the weekend, and that means she won't be around to stalk you for 2 whole days. And if those aren't enough reasons, then just remember how much she hates to lose, and she'll have to spend the weekend with her mom. That is something she does not want to do." Greg shook his head and chuckled at this. "So what's been up with her lately? I mean, normally she avoids me like the plague. Now every time I turn around, she's either staring at me or trying to do something nice for me. It's kinda creepy." Christy reached up to touch the side of Greg's face. "Maybe she's finally realized what a great guy you are." "I think she's a nut job." "Why do you live with her?" Greg asked. "Hey, be nice," Christy snapped, and then continued in a softer tone, "We've been best friends since 1st grade, and besides I couldn't afford to rent this place and go to school full-time without her. I'm just tired of always losing to her. Please, do this for me, Greg." Then realizing that she hadn't swayed him, Christy stepped up to Greg and ran her dainty hand over his muscular chest. Seeing his resolve weaken, she leaned in, brushing her breasts against his arm as she stood on her toes and kissed him on the neck. "Please," she cooed sexily. Greg looked down at the petite blonde, already in her golf outfit, and knew he'd be giving in. "But the game kicks off at 1 p.m., your tea time is for what, noon? I'll have to miss it. I promise I'll make it up to you, tonight." This time when Christy kissed Greg, she, very lightly, ran her hand over his rapidly hardening cock. Fine, I'll do it, if that thing even works." "Where did you say you got it?" "From a strange shop in the mall, called Spells R Us. I know it sounds fake, but the wizard who sold it to me was very convincing." Christy gave Greg an impish smile and hurried over to her golf bag. She pulled a small velvet pouch from a side pocket, normally used for holding extra golf balls, and dumped a highly polished black rock into her hand. Greg moved to stand next to her so he could get a better view. Christy turned it over so Greg could see that the stone's otherwise smooth surface was broken by a single strange-looking rune. "It doesn't look like much. The wizard said that all we have to do is touch it at the same time and we'll swap bodies," Christy explained, extending the stone toward Greg. "Did you keep your receipt so you can get your money back when this doesn't work?" Greg laughed and reached out to touch the stone. The instant his hand made contact with the smooth surface, an electric shock ran through him. Then, he blinked and realized he was looking up at himself. "Holy shit! It worked," Greg exclaimed in Christy's higher tones, and dropped the stone as she reached up to clutch her breasts. The stone hit the floor with a thud and then rolled about a foot before coming to a stop next to the wall. Christy stumbled backward and had to reach out with a powerful hand to grip the wall for balance. For a moment the two just stared at each other in shock. "Fuck. This is the weirdest thing ever," Christy muttered as he reached between his legs to grasp his new appendage. Then he glanced over at the short blonde woman feeling herself up and said, "If you're not careful you'll prove the old saying about blondes having more fun." "What?" Greg said, distractedly, and then added, "How can you be so calm?" Christy, ignoring Greg's comment, bent down and picked up the stone, and after making sure it wasn't damaged, he returned it to the purple pouch. Then he stuffed the pouch back into the golf bag. When Christy turned around, he saw that Greg had moved to stand in front of the mirror hanging from the wall next to the door. Greg slowly reached up, touching her smooth cheeks with her dainty fingers. The image of Christy's astonished face in the mirror stared back as she copied Greg's movements. Time seemed to stand still for Greg as his bewildered mind tried to process the impossible signals it was receiving. "This is so cool," cried the new man. Greg, at Christy's exclamation, turned around and saw that he'd picked up the coffee table and was holding it over his head with one hand. "I can't believe how strong I am." Then, seeing the look on Greg's face, Christy put the table down. "We should get out to the club, but I need to check something first," Christy said, walking over to Greg. Christy put two large hands on each of Greg's shoulders to make sure he had her attention. "Check what?" "Tell me your name?" Christy asked. "You know who I am," Greg snapped. "Just humor me and tell me your real name." "It's Christina Summers." As the words left Greg's mouth, her eyes widened in shock. "That's not what I meant to say. I meant to say that my name is Christina. No, damn it, I'm Christy and I'm really a girl." At this, a confused, panicky look flashed over Greg's cute face, and Christy couldn't help chuckling. "I guess the wizard wasn't lying." "What are you talking about?" Christy allowed his hands to drop and continued. "He said that the stone originally belonged to a sorcerer who used it to try to achieve immortality by swapping into younger bodies. Part of the magic of the swapping stone forces anyone who uses it to assume the identity of the body they're in." "What do you mean, assume the identity?" Greg said, with a frightened look on her cute face. "I don't know everything, but from what the wizard said, we'd be compelled to act like each other, or at least how we think the other person acts." He wasn't very clear on this point. He did say that neither of us would be able to tell anyone else about the swap. At this, Greg's pale skin flushed with anger. "You should have told me that before we swapped." "I don't think I want to do this now. Let's swap back." Christy drew himself up to his full height, towering more than a foot above Greg. "No way. You agreed to do this." Abruptly, Greg felt small, weak, and intimidated by Christy's large size and strength. In the past, Greg had always thought he'd been able to talk Christy into doing what he wanted. Now Greg wondered if she'd been guilty of using her size to coerce Christy without realizing it. "Besides," Christy continued, "I can't afford to lose this bet." "You can't give up the apartment for the rest of the weekend?" Greg asked. "Aw, that wasn't my end of the bet." Christy's rugged face looked chagrined. "What do you have to do if you lose?" Greg said, folding her arms below her breasts just like Christy did when she was mad. At this, Christy turned around and picked up the golf bag. "Let me take this to the car for you, sweetheart." "Don't change the subject," Greg shrilled and stamped a dainty foot. "I want to know what happens if I lose." Christy shrugged his broad shoulders. "Look, you're almost good enough to be a professional golfer. Beat Alice and there's nothing to worry." The cool fall breeze played with Greg's ponytail as she watched Alice move up onto the tee box. By the time Greg and Christy had arrived at the country club, Alice had already been through a bucket of balls and was ready to play. Alice's elegant mother, Joyce, was with her, and as usual they were arguing. Joyce wanted Alice to move back home. Christy had grabbed Greg for a quick kiss and whispered, "Kick her ass, babe." Then he waved goodbye and headed to the sports bar at the south end of the country club. Now Greg watched the tall thin brunette address her ball and felt a little worried. Not about the game, but about her reaction to kissing her former body. She'd sort of melted into Christy's arms, her face flushed and her heart racing. Christy had said that the magic would compel them to act like each other. Did that mean she was now attracted to men? Ting, the sound of Alice's club making smooth contact with her ball brought Greg's attention back to the present. "Nice shot," Joyce said. Greg watched the ball fly out in a straight line to drop cleanly in the fairway. Greg glanced over at Alice's mother, feeling a little irritated. Christy hadn't said that Joyce would be playing as well. Greg knew that Christy was close to Joyce, since she and Alice had grown up a couple of blocks apart, and was a little worried that she'd say or do something to give her identity away. "I'm so going to kick your butt, Christy." Alice laughed. "Now, Alice, there's no reason to be so competitive," Joyce said, moving up to take her shot. "Not if I've got anything to say about it," Greg thought. Wishing that she'd had time to hit a bucket of balls, Greg watched Joyce hit a low-line drive that skimmed the surface of the grass and actually outdistanced Alice's drive. Once Joyce moved out of the tee box, Greg teed up her first shot. "All right, nice and smooth," Greg thought, "let the club do the work." Even as she made contact with the ball, Greg knew it would be a terrible shot. She was rapidly adjusting to Christy's body, but it still didn't feel quite natural. The movement of her breasts as she swung her club was distracting, and her shorter arms had thrown her off. The ball leapt off the tee and sliced into the trees next to the fairway. "Not too bad, for you, Christy." Alice grinned. "Would you like to take your mulligan now?" Greg bit back the retort and said as sweetly as she could, "Not yet, thanks." By the time Greg got to the 7th hole, she was starting to get worried. She'd only been in Christy's body for a couple of hours and she still wasn't used to it. What was Christy thinking, swapping with me last minute like that? Greg wondered. She was 5 strokes behind Alice and was lucky to be this close. She'd actually tied Alice the last 2 holes. They were both trailing Joyce, who seemed happily oblivious to the competitiveness of the 2 younger women. Since she hadn't won a hole yet, Greg was once again watching Joyce and then Alice as they teed off. Alice had good form and a smooth swing that sent the ball sailing down the fairway. Her tall, athletic build allowed her to generate a good amount of club speed, which meant that she was getting more distance on her drives than Greg. Alice had always been a tomboy and had been great at sports, Greg remembered, feeling anxious. Greg knew she was still adjusting to Christy's body, which wasn't nearly as athletic as Alice. "Shit, at this rate I'll be lucky to win," Greg thought. Greg couldn't help admiring Alice's body as she bent over to retrieve her tee. Alice's nose may be a little too big and she's got almost no tits, but there's nothing wrong with her legs and ass. Even as those thoughts floated through Greg's confused mind, she realized that she wasn't the least bit attracted to Alice. It was more like an acknowledgement that her friend had a very fit body. Nothing more. This time Greg made good contact with the ball, and despite not getting as much distance as Alice, she won the hole. "Ha! And the comeback begins," Greg said gently, taunting Alice. "Those lessons you were talking about must have paid off, Christy," Alice agreed, as they pushed their carts toward the next hole. "That putt you sank was terrific. But I'm still going to win." "Thanks," Greg replied. "You better watch out, I'm only down by 4 now." Realizing that she wouldn't be able to outdrive Alice, Greg focused on her short game and won the next 2 holes, closing out the front 9 down by 2 strokes. "Well, girls, this is where I'm going to have to leave you," Joyce said, and then beamed over at Alice. I've got some errands to run and then I'll be making lasagna for dinner. Please be at the house by 6, dear. Your father and I are both looking forward to having you home tonight. After Joyce and Alice said their goodbyes, Greg looked over at Alice. I thought you were spending the night with your folks if I won. Are you admitting defeat? At that, Alice laughed. Of course not. I plan to win. But it's been a long time since I stayed over at my folks' place, and you know how Mom is always after me to come over. I figured this would make her happy and get her off my back for a while. Feeling confused, Greg said, let's take a quick break before we start the back nine. I'd like to see how Greg is doing. Sure, I could use some water and a quick snack. Where's Greg? He could have played with us. Oh, he wanted to watch some dumb football game. The words were out before Greg realized she'd said them. Now, why did I call football dumb? Greg wondered. Greg loved watching State play and had played herself when she'd been in high school. Greg moved through the club to the sports bar, noticing that it was about half full. She quickly spotted Christy at the bar. He was looking at a large flat screen that showed the game was just into the second quarter. As Greg moved toward Christy, she saw his head turn to follow a well-endowed waitress flounce by. Feeling both amused and irritated, Greg hit Christy on the shoulder. Hey, you can put your eyes back in your head. Christy turned to face Greg, looking embarrassed. Then he grinned. I can't help it. Besides, if she's gonna advertise, then I'm gonna look. It was a line that Greg had used on Christy, and until now she hadn't realized how annoying it was. So, how are you doing, babe? Christy asked. I'm down by 2, Greg said, suddenly angry. Why did you wait until just before the game to switch? If I'd had a couple more hours as you, or had a chance to hit a bucket of balls, I'd be up by half a dozen strokes. Christy slid off the bar stool and wrapped Greg in a powerful hug. Keep your voice down. Christy waited a second and then gave Greg another squeeze before letting go. I waited until the last minute for that very reason. Alice knows me. If I showed up and was suddenly way better than her, she'd know I was cheating. You can only win by a little, or she might figure out that something's wrong. Greg felt a shiver run down her spine. There was no way she wanted Alice to know that she'd swapped bodies with Christy. Alice would never let her forget it and would probably use it for future blackmail. Besides, I was also worried about the compulsion. You see. What are you talking about? Greg interrupted. Haven't you noticed any changes since the switch? Christy asked, and then continued in a rush. I normally hate football. But I can't stop watching this game. I think it's because I know you love it, so now I've got to watch it. I'm also not normally attracted to women, but you caught me checking out the waitress. Greg nodded. Yeah, when we left the house, I felt really uncoordinated, but now I feel fine, almost natural. But that's a good thing, or I'd be hopelessly behind right now. Up to a point. I've never beaten Alice at golf. If you're me too long, the compulsion might cause you to throw the round. That's why I told Alice I was taking lessons, and I've made a point to tell her I'm practicing every day. I'm trying to make it reasonable that I might win. Greg looked at Christy, feeling stunned. Okay, I think it's time you told me what happens if I lose. Christy nodded, and then his eyes widened. Hi, Alice. Well, babe, it looks like your break is over. As Greg made her way to the 10th hole, she had a sense of foreboding. Christy's comment about the compulsion to be the person you'd swapped with worried Greg. What if she started playing badly because she knew the real Christy was a terrible golfer? Since she'd won the last hole, Greg got to tee off first. She took her time and made solid contact and felt her worries subside a little. The ball flew down the fairway, bouncing to a stop before the dogleg, setting up Greg's second shot. As it turned out, this was Alice's worst hole. By the time Greg sank her putt, she was up by 3 strokes on the hole, and now in the lead. Greg must have given you some good advice. Alice groused as they walked to the next hole. You played that hole just like he does. Greg shivered. I told you I've been taking lessons and Greg always gives good advice. At this, Alice nodded. So have you slept with him yet? Alice! Greg shrieked, feeling shocked. Oh, come on girl, I know you want him, and it's not like either of us are virgins. Besides, I need to know how far you've gone with him, especially if I win. I'm going to tee off now, Greg said, blushing in embarrassment and surprising herself. She tried to tell Alice that a gentleman doesn't kiss and tell. But instead it had come out differently, as if she were embarrassed by the conversation. Alice's laugh at her friend's discomfort added to the illusion. It must be the compulsion, Greg thought, as she teed up the shot. Christy would probably get super embarrassed by the question, and reacting just like she would have. This time the club seemed to twist in Greg's hands and the ball sailed for the second time that day into the trees. Darn it! Greg said, in Christy's alto. Greg angrily stuffed her club back into her bag and started to feel worried. She'd meant to say fuck, but since that was a word Christy never used, it had come out as darn it. This time when Alice hit the ball, it flew perfectly down the fairway. Miraculously, Greg managed to tie the hole. It felt like Christy's reminder of the compulsion had caused it to become stronger. By the 15th hole, Alice and Greg were once again tied. Greg was now more nervous than she'd ever been on the golf course. Come on, Greg thought, you've been playing ever since you were a little girl, you've got this. Greg took 2 more steps before she realized what she'd thought and stumbled as a panicky feeling twisted her stomach into knots. I was never a little girl. Greg wanted to scream. Are you okay, Christy? Alice asked, laughter coloring her question. Somehow, Greg managed to pull out ties on the 16th and 17th holes. Each shot had felt like a battle against a set of unseen chains. Alice had sliced her drive off the 16th hole and Greg had got onto the green with a shot at par. Then it had taken 3 strokes to sink it, allowing Alice to catch up. On the 17th they both played well, making no errors, and bogeyed the hole. It's official, Greg thought, as she walked behind Alice to the last hole. I'm playing the worst round of golf of my life. Still tied, they set up to tee off on 18. So do you have it? Alice asked, as she selected a driver. Have what? Greg asked. Don't play dumb, Christy, Alice said. Did you bring the stone the wizard sold us? Greg wanted to say no, or to say that she had no idea what Alice was talking about. Instead she said, of course, it's right here in my bag. Great, after I win this hole, we can settle up. What makes you think you'll win? Greg said, feeling more than a little frightened. And what do you win, she thought, wanting more than anything just to ask Alice, but of course she couldn't. Christy knew the stakes. Why? Because I'm Alice and you're Christy, and I always win when we play golf, Alice said matter-of-factly, and then moved to tee up her ball. Now Greg couldn't do anything right. Her first shot went into the rough and her second into the water hazard. By the time Greg got to the green, she was behind Alice by 2 strokes. You're farther out, it's your shot, Alice said, smugly, as Christy pulled her putter from her bag. I know, remind me again, what do you win if you win this hole? Greg asked as innocently as she could, and held her breath. You're so funny, but I'm not letting you out of it. If I win, we use the stone. For a second Greg's mind refused to work. You want to swap bodies? Alice shook her head. Just putt, and don't even think about welching. Even though her mind was spinning, Greg moved over to squat behind her ball and examine the shot. Well, now I know why Christy wanted to win so badly. She doesn't want to trade bodies with Alice. I wonder how long she agreed to stay swapped. Greg thought, and shuddered at the idea of her hot little girlfriend in Alice's lanky body. For a second she tried to imagine making out with Alice and then shook her head. Okay, Christy, focus, Greg said softly. She carefully lined up the shot. You've got this. A 12-foot putt is tough, but you've made them before. Aim a little to the right of the hole. The hill will draw the ball back. Greg thought, and then smoothly swung her putter. For a second, Greg thought she'd hit the ball too hard, but the green was running slow, and when her ball started to arc toward the hole, Greg knew it was going to go in. The sound of the ball dropping into the cup was the sweetest sound Greg had ever heard. Wow, Christy, that was a great shot. Alice was already standing next to her ball looking confident. Greg moved around to stand to one side as Alice made smooth contact with the ball. At 6 feet, the ball raced toward the hole with what looked like the perfect amount of touch. Then it started slowing down. At 4 feet, Greg knew Alice hadn't hit it hard enough. The ball came to a stop a foot and a half out. Geez, these greens are running slow, Alice commented, walking around the hole. Greg felt her heart flutter with hope. This wasn't a terribly hard shot, but she'd seen Alice miss today from inside a foot. God, please let her rush this, Greg whispered in a quick prayer. If Alice missed and then sank it on her next shot, they would still be tied and the bet would be off. At this point, Greg would take that as a win. Greg could feel the sweat beating up on her forehead and running down between her breasts as she watched Alice approach the ball. Slowly and carefully, Alice tapped the ball. It rolled forward and Greg's breath caught. She didn't hit it hard enough. Elation filled Greg as she watched the ball roll closer and closer to the hole. As it got to the edge, it was barely moving, and for a second it looked like it stopped. Then it seemed to teeter for an instant, before dropping into the cup. Alice walked over and patted Greg on the back. Hey, don't feel bad, that's the closest you've come to beating me. Those golf lessons are really paying off. Greg's mind was still in shock, as she watched Alice moved over to Christy's golf bag, reached down to unzip the side compartment holding the swapping stone. Hey, what are you doing? Greg asked, her voice now filled with alarm. Alice upended the pouch and caught the white stone. I guess the wizard wasn't lying about how powerful the compulsion is, Alice said, turning to face Greg, who was backing away. Aw, come on now, you promised we'd swap back as soon as I could beat you at golf. It's taken a week, but the compulsion finally worked. I won, fair and square. Just wait a second, shouldn't we go find some privacy first? Besides, Greg's here, let's wait until we get home. Then Alice's words penetrated Greg's befuddled brain and she froze. Don't worry, no one will notice anything, and I'd rather do it now while Greg's watching football. Greg wanted to shout, I'm not Christy or Alice, I'm Greg. But the compulsion held her like a bug in amber. Then, without waiting for Greg to say another word, Alice stepped over and touched the stone to Greg's arm. Greg felt a shock like a jolt of electricity, and then she blinked. Christy's face broke into a huge smile. I'm me again, she whispered. Without really thinking about it, Greg dropped the now black stone and lifted her new hands to examine them. "I'm Alice," Greg stated in shock. Before Greg could say another word, Christy snatched the stone from the ground and started running toward the water trap. At first Greg was too stunned to move, then she realized what Christy was about to do and sprinted after her. Greg stumbled, not quite used to her new, longer legs and strange body. Then she regained her balance and raced after the shorter woman. "Christy, no, wait, stop. You don't understand. I'm..." Greg's voice trailed off as she tried to tell Christy that she was really Greg, however the compulsion clamped down. It felt to Greg like she and Christy were running in slow motion. Her mind refused to accept what was happening. Greg closed the distance. 20 feet behind Christy. 15 feet behind. 10 feet. Then Christy was at the edge of the pond and she drew back her arm. "No," Greg shouted, reaching for Christy's hand. Then Christy's arm snapped forward and she threw the swapping stone. The black rock sailed into the water with a splash. Greg just stared at the pond, her heart racing. Christy turned to look at Greg, her face flush with her exertion. "Look, Alice, I know we agreed to use that thing, but it's evil. Just think about this last week. You've never really liked Greg, but you know I love him, so you were all over him. We agreed to this stupid golf bet before we swapped, and then when I wanted to call it off and just swap back, you said no. Then you hid the stone and pretended you were me. The compulsion made me be you. I don't know if it was the magic that caused you to do that or if I should be mad at you for trying to steal my life. Just be happy I'm blaming the compulsion and let it go." Greg wanted to tell her that she wasn't Alice, but she couldn't get the words out. Instead, when she opened her mouth, she said, "You're probably right." Just then there was the sound of footsteps and Greg turned around. Heading toward them, effortlessly carrying both sets of clubs, was her former male body. "Hello, ladies!" Alice shouted, a big grin plastering his face. "So who won?" Christy smiled up at the man she thought was her boyfriend. "I did, at last." "Awesome," Alice said, dropping the club, sweeping Christy up into a big hug while planting a passionate kiss on her mouth. Rage and jealousy washed through Greg as she watched them kissing, and after a few seconds she cleared her throat. "Just get a hotel room, will ya?" Greg felt all the color drain from her face. That was a line that Alice had used on them last weekend when she'd caught them making out on the couch. Alice glanced over at Greg and smirked. "No need, we've got the apartment for tonight and Sunday, since you're staying over at your folks' place, right?" Before Greg could respond, Christy added, "That was the bet, and your mom is looking forward to seeing you. You don't want to keep her waiting, do you? She's told me that she planned to take you to the spa on Sunday for a complete makeover. Doesn't that sound like fun? You know how much she wants you to start being more feminine. I'll see you on Monday, Alice. I hope you don't let your mom talk you into moving back home." Greg tried to fight the compulsion when she moved forward against her will to collect Alice's clubs. Then as she walked away, she heard Greg say, "Now, babe, you promised me a night of mind-blowing sex if we had the apartment to ourselves." Christy giggled in response. "Then let's get home." Alice wanted to look back, but something kept her from turning around, as tears slid down her smooth cheeks. How she hated Greg!